Octavia Kensington's arthritic fingers trembled as she held the certified letter, the official seal of the Department of Social Services stark against the cream-colored paper. At 93, she had survived the Great Depression, 2 wars, and the slow decay of her once grand Victorian home in Hartford. But this letter, she knew, would be her undoing. Investigation into historical child welfare violations, credible allegations, mandatory family interview scheduled. The words blurred together as her grandson Thaddeus snatched the letter from her weathered hands. At 47, Thad had inherited his grandmother's sharp cheekbones and her talent for compartmentalizing uncomfortable truths. His IT consulting business had been hemorrhaging money for months. His divorce had cleaned out his savings. And now this. "What the hell is this about, Grandma O?" His voice carried the same edge it had when he was 16, and caught sneaking back into the house after curfew. Octavia's pale blue eyes fixed on a water stain spreading across the ceiling. Another repair she couldn't afford. "Language, Thaddeus. Don't deflect. Someone's accusing you of child abuse. From the 1950s. He waved the letter. "They want to interview the whole family. Celia's flying in from Portland tomorrow." The mention of his sister made Octavia's jaw tighten. Celia, at 44, had spent 2 decades as a social worker in Oregon, helping families navigate crisis after crisis. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. "They can't prove anything after all these years," Octavia said, but her voice lacked conviction. Thaddeus studied his grandmother's face, the same face that had taught him to tie his shoes, to drive stick shift, to balance a checkbook. The same face that had never quite looked at him with the warmth she reserved for his sister. Can't they? The Kensington house had been impressive once. Built in 1887 by Octavia's grandfather, a railroad magnate, it boasted 12 rooms, original hardwood floors, and enough Victorian gingerbread trim to make a wedding cake jealous. Now, at 93, Octavia rattled around in it like a marble in a coffee can, too proud to sell, too poor to maintain. Celia arrived on a red-eye flight, her social worker's eye immediately cataloging the home's deterioration. Peeling wallpaper, a furnace that wheezed like an emphysema patient, windows sealed with duct tape against the Connecticut winter. But it was the smell that hit her first, not neglect exactly, but the particular staleness of secrets kept too long. "Jesus, Grandma O, this place is falling apart." "Your language has gotten worse in Oregon," Octavia observed, settling into her threadbare armchair with the careful movements of someone whose bones had begun betraying her. Celia and Thaddeus exchanged glances. Their grandmother had always been formidable, 5'10" even now. With silver hair she still pinned into an elegant chignon every morning, but there was something brittle about her today, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. "We need to talk about this letter," Celia said, producing her own copy. "I've seen investigations like this before. They don't happen without substantial evidence." "Evidence of what?" Octavia's voice was steady, but her hands worried the fabric of her housecoat. "You tell us." Thaddeus had inherited his grandmother's directness, along with her bone structure. "Because if there's something we need to know, something that could come out, we need to prepare." Octavia was quiet for so long that Celia wondered if she'd fallen asleep. Outside, sleet began tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. "There was a child," Octavia finally said. "Before your grandfather died. Before you two were born." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. "What child?" Celia's voice had taken on her professional tone, calm, non-judgmental, encouraging confession. "My sister Magdalene's daughter, Ursula." Octavia spoke the name like it tasted bitter. "After Magdalene died in that car accident in 1952, the girl came to live with us. She was difficult." Thaddeus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What happened to her?" "She ran away. 16 years old, pregnant, wild as a March hare. Good riddance, I thought at the time." Octavia's fingers found the worn spot on her chair's arm, where 3 generations of hands had left their mark. "I reported her missing, of course. But the police said girls like that usually turn up eventually, one way or another." "Girls like what?" Celia's training had taught her to listen for the spaces between words, the truths hidden in casual cruelty. Octavia's mouth compressed into a thin line. Troubled girls, the kind that bring nothing but heartache. The next morning brought investigator Rebecca Morse to their door, a woman in her 50s with the kind of patient persistence that came from 2 decades of coaxing truth from reluctant witnesses. She spread manila folders across Octavia's dining room table like a dealer laying out cards. Mrs. Kensington, I appreciate you agreeing to speak with me. I know this must be difficult. Octavia sat ramrod straight in her chair, every inch the society matron she'd once been. I have nothing to hide. I'm sure you don't. Morse's tone was neutral. Can you tell me about Ursula Blackwood, your niece? As I told my grandchildren, she was a troubled girl. After her mother died, I took her in out of Christian duty. She repaid my kindness by running away. Morse consulted her notes. According to records, Ursula was reported missing on March 15, 1954. But we have hospital records showing she was treated for severe malnutrition and untreated injuries just 2 days later, 60 miles away, in Waterbury. Thaddeus watched his grandmother's face carefully. The only change was a slight tightening around her eyes. If that's true, then she clearly found help somewhere. I'm glad. The thing is, Morse continued, Ursula never really disappeared. She spent the rest of her life in Connecticut, married, had children, worked as a seamstress. She died 3 years ago. Celia felt her professional instincts sharpen. Why didn't she ever come back? Try to reconnect? That's what her daughter wants to know. Morse pulled a photograph from one of the folders. A woman in her 70s with Octavia's sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes. This is Dorothea Blackwood Chen, Ursula's daughter. She's the one who filed the complaint. The photograph seemed to leach all the air from the room. Octavia stared at it with the expression of someone seeing a ghost. Her mother never told her much about her time here, Morse continued. Just that it was unpleasant. But when Dorothea was cleaning out her mother's effects, she found some things. Letters, diary entries, pictures. Pictures of what? Thaddeus's voice was barely above a whisper. Morse reached into another folder. The black and white photographs were small, faded, but clear enough. A teenage girl's back, crisscrossed with welts, bruises on thin arms. A face so gaunt, the cheekbones stood out like knife blades. Jesus Christ. Celia's professional composure cracked. Your niece documented her injuries obsessively, Morse explained. She hid a camera and took pictures whenever she could. She also wrote letters, dozens of them, to teachers, neighbors, even the police. None were ever sent. Octavia hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. She stared at the photographs with the fixation of someone memorizing the face of an enemy. There's more, Morse said quietly. Medical records from when she was found. Evidence of prolonged starvation. Old fractures that healed improperly. And, she paused, signs of sexual abuse. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the old house seemed to hold its breath. That's impossible. Octavia's voice was strangled. Harold would never. I would never allow. Harold was your husband? He died in 1955. Cancer. Octavia's composure was cracking, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. He was a good man. A deacon at our church. He would never touch a child inappropriately. Maybe not Harold, Morse said. But according to Ursula's records, there were other men. Visitors to the house. She wrote their names down. After Morse left, the 3 of them sat in Octavia's parlor like survivors of a bombing, too stunned to move, too damaged to speak. The afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows felt different now, charged with the electricity of secrets finally exposed to air. Grandma O. Thaddeus's voice was careful, the way you might speak to someone standing on a ledge. We need to know what really happened. I've told you what happened. The girl was troubled. Stop. Celia's word cut through her grandmother's protestations like a blade. Just stop. I've worked with abused children for 20 years. I know the signs, I know the patterns, and I know the lies families tell themselves. Octavia's pale eyes flashed. You think you know everything, don't you? Coming back here with your college degrees and your social work theories, judging what you don't understand. Then make me understand. Celia leaned forward. Because right now, all I understand is that a 16-year-old girl ran away from this house half dead, and you never once tried to find her, or help her, or even ask if she was all right. She wasn't my responsibility, Octavia snapped, but her voice cracked on the words. She was a child, your sister's child. She was absolutely your responsibility. Thaddeus watched this confrontation with growing horror. These were the two women who had raised him, who had taught him right from wrong, who had been his moral compass. Now they sat across from each other like enemies, decades of buried truth finally surfacing. There's something else, he said quietly. Both women turned to him. I've been thinking about it all afternoon, about why this house always felt off, about why you never talked about family, never had visitors, never seemed to have friends. He took a shuddering breath. About why you always had money for the taxes and utilities but never for repairs or maintenance. Thaddeus, don't. Someone's been paying you. All these years. Someone's been sending money to keep you quiet. Octavia's face went white as old bone. Who? Celia's voice was deadly quiet. When her grandmother didn't answer, Thaddeus stood and walked to the old secretary desk in the corner, the one that had been off limits their entire childhood. He tried the drawers. Locked, of course. But the wood was old and the locks were older. Don't. Octavia's command carried all the authority of her 93 years. But Thaddeus was past caring. The drawer splintered open easily. Inside were bank statements, money orders, letters, decades of correspondence with names he didn't recognize, #meta, sex, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth like a religious relic, was a leather-bound journal. Put that back immediately. But Thaddeus was already reading, his face growing paler with each page. Jesus. Grandma O, what did you do? What I had to do. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Celia moved to read over her brother's shoulder. The journal was written in Octavia's careful penmanship, but the words seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Names, dates, amounts. A careful record of transactions that made her stomach turn. You sold her. Celia's voice was wondering, horrified. You sold Ursula. I found her a home. People who could provide for her. You sold a 16-year-old girl to men who wanted to use her. Thaddeus looked up from the journal, his eyes blazing. And you've been taking payments ever since to keep quiet about it. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Octavia sat frozen in her chair, the weight of 70 years finally settling on her shoulders. She was pregnant when she left, she whispered. Wild, uncontrollable. What was I supposed to do? I was a widow with a reputation to maintain, a house to keep up. Harold's medical bills had nearly bankrupted us. So you found buyers? Celia's professional demeanor was gone now, replaced by raw disgust. Rich men who paid well for young girls. It wasn't like that. But even Octavia didn't sound convinced. Then what was it like? Thaddeus slammed the journal down on the coffee table. Because this reads like a business ledger. Names, services rendered, payment schedules. Octavia's hands shook as she reached for the journal. I did what I thought was best. For everyone. Best for who? Because it sure as hell wasn't best for Ursula. The revelation changed everything, and nothing. The house still leaked. The bills still came due, and Octavia still sat in her threadbare chair watching the world through grimy windows. But now the silence felt different. Heavy with the weight of truth, instead of the lightness of willful ignorance. Dorothea Blackwood Chen arrived 3 days later, driving a sensible Toyota Camry and wearing a cardigan that had seen better years. At 71, she carried her mother's hollow eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin, but none of their hardness. I didn't come here for an apology, she said, settling into Harold's old chair across from Octavia. I came to understand. Celia and Thaddeus flanked their grandmother like bodyguards, but Octavia seemed to have aged a decade in the past week. She looked fragile now. Breakable. What do you want to know? Octavia's voice was barely audible. Everything. My mother never told me about this place, about what happened here. I grew up thinking my grandmother was dead, that my mother was an orphan. It wasn't until I found her things that I learned the truth. Dorothea pulled out a shoebox, the kind children use for school projects. Inside were the letters, the photographs, and something else. A birth certificate with the name Octavia recognized. She kept your son's birth certificate, the baby she was carrying when she ran away. Dorothea's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. My brother, your great-nephew. He's been looking for family his whole life. The words hit Octavia like physical blows. A son. Ursula's son. Her blood. Where? Octavia's voice cracked. Where is he? Living in Michigan. He's a carpenter, has 3 kids of his own. Good kids, from what my mother told me. Dorothea's eyes were hard as flint. He doesn't know the whole story yet, just that his mother ran away from home as a teenager. Thaddeus cleared his throat. What do you want from us? Justice would be nice, but most of the men who hurt my mother are dead now. The ones who aren't are too old for prosecution. Dorothea's laugh was bitter. What I really want is acknowledgement. I want her to say it out loud. All eyes turned to Octavia. The old woman sat hunched in her chair, looking smaller and more fragile than any of them had ever seen her. I sold your mother to men who used her, Octavia whispered. I took money to keep quiet about it. I let them hurt her, because it was easier than fighting for her. The words seemed to cost her everything she had left. And? Dorothea's voice was relentless. And I've spent 70 years telling myself it was necessary, that I had no choice, that she was better off somewhere else. Octavia looked up, her pale eyes streaming. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was selfish. And I destroyed an innocent child to protect myself. The legal proceedings that followed were a nightmare of bureaucracy and media attention. The story broke in the Hartford Courant first. Society matron's dark secret exposed. Then spread to regional papers and finally to cable news. Suddenly, everyone wanted to interview the 93-year-old woman who had sold her teenage niece into what amounted to sexual slavery. Octavia refused all interviews, but that didn't stop reporters from camping on her lawn, or photographers from taking pictures through her windows. Thaddeus hired a lawyer, one he couldn't afford, to field the legal challenges that came rolling in like waves. The statute of limitations has run out on most criminal charges, the lawyer explained during a meeting in Octavia's parlor. But there could be civil suits, wrongful imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy charges, if they can prove you were part of an organized trafficking ring. Were you? Thaddeus asked his grandmother directly. Part of something bigger. Octavia considered the question with the careful attention she might give to a crossword puzzle. There were others. Women in similar situations. We helped each other. The euphemism hung in the air like incense in a church. Jesus Christ. Celia buried her face in her hands. #meta. But the criminal charges weren't their biggest problem. The real issue was money, or rather, the lack of it. The investigation had frozen Octavia's bank accounts pending determination of whether her assets were proceeds of criminal activity. The house, already mortgaged to the hilt, was in danger of foreclosure. We could lose everything, Thaddeus told his sister one evening, as they sat in the kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine and trying to process the magnitude of their situation. Good. Celia's response surprised him. We should lose everything. This house, that money, it's all tainted. It's all built on the suffering of a child. Easy for you to say. You have a job, a life in Oregon. I've got nothing but debts and a business that's circling the drain. So we start over. At 47? With what? Celia poured herself another glass of wine. With the truth, maybe. For once in this family's history. Dorothea's proposal came 3 weeks later, delivered in a handwritten letter that arrived between a foreclosure notice and a summons to appear in civil court. Dear Mrs. Kensington, I've been thinking about our situation, and yes, I consider it our situation now, whether any of us like it or not. My mother is dead, The men who hurt her are mostly dead, and putting a 93-year-old woman in prison won't bring justice to anyone. But there might be another way. I've spoken with my brother, your great-nephew Thomas. He's interested in meeting you, despite everything. His children are curious about their family history. They're good kids, the kind my mother would have been proud to know. Here's what I propose. Instead of letting the lawyers and the courts decide what happens to your assets, why don't we make our own decision? You sign the house over to Thomas. He's been looking for a project, something to keep him busy in retirement. The place needs work, a lot of work, but he's good with his hands. In return, you can live here for the rest of your life. Thomas will take care of the repairs, the taxes, the maintenance. You'll have family around, real family, not just obligation family. And maybe, if you're willing, you can tell his children the stories my mother never got to tell. The money in your account, the blood money, let's call it what it is, gets donated to organizations that help trafficked children. All of it. Every penny. I know this isn't justice in any legal sense, but it might be justice in a human sense. My mother used to say that healing was more important than revenge. I'm finally old enough to understand what she meant. Think about it. Dorothea. Octavia read the letter 3 times before showing it to her grandchildren. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its mercy. "She's offering us a way out," Thaddeus said after reading it. "She's offering us redemption," Celia corrected. "There's a difference." Octavia folded the letter carefully and placed it on the coffee table. "What do you think I should do?" It was the first time in their lives she had asked for their opinion on anything important. "I think," Celia said slowly, "that for the first time in 70 years, you have a chance to do the right thing. The question is, whether you're brave enough to take it." Thomas Blackwood arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, driving a pickup truck that had seen better days and carrying a thermos of coffee that smelled like salvation. At 69, he had the kind of weathered hands that came from a lifetime of honest work, and eyes that crinkled easily into smile lines. He stood in the foyer of his great-aunt's house, his house now, technically, and took in the peeling wallpaper, the water-stained ceiling, the general air of genteel decay. "She's got good bones," he said to Octavia, who hovered nervously in the doorway. "The house, I mean. Just needs some love." "It needs more than love. It needs a complete renovation." Thomas grinned, and suddenly Octavia could see the child Ursula had been, the bright, curious girl who had arrived at her door 70 years ago. "Lucky for you. I like a challenge." The arrangement they worked out over the following weeks was more complex than Dorothea's letter had suggested. Thomas would take over the mortgage payments and handle the renovations, but Octavia would retain a life estate, the legal right to live in the house until her death. The blood money would be donated, but in installments over several years, to maximize tax benefits for the receiving organizations. More importantly, Thomas brought his children and grandchildren for visits. The house that had been silent for decades suddenly echoed with the sounds of family, children laughing, teenagers arguing, adults debating politics over dinner. "It's not forgiveness," Dorothea told Octavia during one of these gatherings. "I can't forgive what happened to my mother. But it might be acceptance of what was, and what is, and what could still be." Octavia nodded, understanding the distinction. Forgiveness would have been too easy, too clean. This was messier, more complicated, and therefore more real. As Thomas worked on the house, stripping wallpaper, replacing rotted floorboards, updating electrical systems that predated the Korean War, Octavia found herself telling stories she had never told before. Not the sanitized family history she had shared with Thaddeus and Celia, but the real stories. The complicated, ugly, human truth of the Kensington family. She told Thomas about his grandmother Magdalene, how she had been the wild child, the rebel, the one who ran off to marry a jazz musician against their parents' wishes. How she had died in a car accident on her way home from a lover who wasn't her husband, leaving behind a daughter who looked just like her. She told him about Harold, not the saintly deacon she had invented for public consumption, but the real man. Weak, easily led, addicted to gambling and always in debt to the wrong people. How his final illness had bankrupted them, leaving her alone with a house she couldn't afford and a reputation she couldn't bear to lose. She told him about the other woman, the network of widows and spinsters who had found ways to monetize their desperation. How they had convinced themselves they were helping, providing opportunities for girls who had nowhere else to go. "We told ourselves we were matchmakers," she said one afternoon, as they sat on the front porch watching Thomas's grandson play in the yard. "That we were finding these girls homes, husbands, futures." "But you knew better," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "I knew better. But knowing better and doing better are different things." Thomas was quiet for a long time, sanding a piece of trim with the steady rhythm of someone who found peace in repetitive work. "My mother used to have nightmares," he said eventually. "Even when I was grown, married, had kids of my own. She'd call me in the middle of the night, crying, talking about men whose names I didn't recognize." Octavia closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know you are. The question is what you're going to do about it." Octavia's health began failing in earnest during Thomas's second year of renovations. The cancer had been there for months, growing quietly while she focused on lawyers and reporters and the complex mathematics of atonement. By the time the doctors found it, it had spread too far for aggressive treatment. "How long?" Celia asked the oncologist. 6 months, maybe 8 if she's lucky. Octavia laughed when they told her. Lucky. That's one word for it. She spent her remaining time carefully documenting everything she could remember. Names, dates, addresses, the complete record of the network she had been part of. She worked with investigators from 3 states, helping them build cases against the few perpetrators who were still alive and competent to stand trial. She also worked on something else. A different kind of testimony. A memoir of sorts, but not the kind intended for publication. This was for Thomas's children and grandchildren, for the family that would inherit not just the house, but the complicated legacy that came with it. "Don't make me into a victim," she told Celia, who was helping her organize the material. "I wasn't a victim. I was a perpetrator who got caught. There's a difference. You were also human, flawed, selfish, scared, but human. That's not an excuse. No, but it's an explanation. And sometimes explanation is the best we can do." The memoir, when it was finished, was brutal in its honesty. Octavia spared herself nothing. Not the greed, not the cowardice, not the willful blindness that had allowed her to participate in something monstrous. But she also didn't romanticize her awakening. There was no moment of clarity. Sex 0.05. No dramatic revelation. Just the slow, grinding recognition that she had spent most of her life on the wrong side of history. Octavia died on a Thursday morning in late autumn, with Thomas holding one hand and Celia holding the other. She had lived long enough to see the house's renovation nearly complete, to watch Thomas's youngest granddaughter take her first steps in the parlor, where Ursula had once cowered in fear. The funeral was small family only, plus a few representatives from the organizations that had benefited from her donations. There were no eulogies, no attempts to redeem or explain. Just a simple service that acknowledged the complexity of a life that had contained both great evil and small redemptions. The will, when it was read, contained no surprises. Thomas inherited the house free and clear, along with the remainder of Octavia's assets, about $30,000 that represented a lifetime of careful budgeting rather than blood money. Thaddeus and Celia each received personal items, photographs, books, small pieces of jewelry that had belonged to their mother. But the real inheritance was something else entirely. In the months following Octavia's death, as Thomas continued his renovations and his family continued to gather in the house that had once been a place of horror, they found themselves becoming the custodians of a different kind of legacy. The house became, in its way, a monument, not to the crimes that had been committed there, but to the possibility of facing those crimes honestly. Thomas turned Ursula's old room into a library, filling it with books about trauma, recovery, and justice. He established a small nonprofit that helped adult survivors of childhood trafficking find housing and employment. "It doesn't balance the books," he told a reporter who came to read a follow-up story. "Nothing we do will ever balance those books. But maybe it keeps the story from ending with the horror. Maybe it lets us write a different ending." 5 years after Octavia's death, the house on Elm Street looked nothing like the decaying Victorian that had sheltered so many secrets. Thomas had stripped it down to its bones and built it back up. New plumbing, new electrical, new windows that let in light instead of keeping it out. The walls that had witnessed Ursula's suffering now echoed with the voices of children who had never known anything but love. Celia retired from social work and moved back to Connecticut, taking a part-time position with Thomas's nonprofit. She specialized in working with older survivors, women who had spent decades trying to process traumas they had never been allowed to name. Thaddeus rebuilt his consulting business, but with a different focus now. He worked exclusively with organizations that served vulnerable populations, using his technical skills to help them secure their data and protect their clients' privacy. The work paid less than his corporate contracts had, stat meta, sex 0.05, but it let him sleep at night. The three of them, Thomas, Celia, and Thaddeus, met for dinner every Sunday in the dining room, where Octavia had once entertained the social elite of Hartford. They talked about their children, about politics, about the endless renovations an old house required. Sometimes they talked about Octavia, about Ursula, about the weight of inheriting a legacy built on others' suffering. But mostly, they talked about the future, about Thomas's granddaughter's college plans, about Celia's new relationship with a fellow social worker, about Thaddeus's tentative steps toward dating again, about the ordinary business of building a life on the ruins of the past. The house held all of these conversations with equal grace. It had learned, perhaps, that buildings like families could survive almost anything if they were willing to face the truth about what they had been and who they wanted to become. On the wall of the front hallway, where visitors couldn't miss it, Thomas had hung a simple plaque. It contained no names, no dates, no attempt at explanation. Just a single line that Octavia had written in her memoir. The only way to inherit evil is to perpetuate it. The only way to inherit good is to create it. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't redemption. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of something better than both. The recognition that every generation has the power to decide what it will pass on to the next, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to hand down the poison your ancestors left in your cup. The story continued, as all family stories do messier and more complicated than any simple moral, but shot through with the stubborn human capacity for choosing, again and again, to be better than the worst things that had been done in the name of love.